afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me today to introduce an afternoon devoted to considering a fascinating topic, the easy military questions, the hard cultural question. If the title is an accurate guide to this topic, then the speaker addressing it would need to be a remarkably and variously gifted man. And I think we have just that tonight in our speaker. I think it would be right to describe Dr. Luttwak as Edward Luttwak as a Renaissance man, provided we recall that the Renaissance, in addition to the paintings and sculptures of Leonardo and Michelangelo, also included Cesare Borgia, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the arts of politics and military affairs. Dr. Luttwak is a military and political strategist with an international reputation. Go to Amazon, and there are more than 20 books by him available. He's fluent in 5 languages. He was born in Romania, and he's been a senior associate at several think tanks like CSIS in Washington. He attended the London School of Economics, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Bath, where he received in turn a B.Sc.Econ, a PhD, and an LLD Honoris Causa. He served at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force. He founded and today directs a conservation cattle ranch in the Bolivian Amazon. Before ever writing of strategy and war, he was combat trained in the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, and he's fought as a volunteer or contractor in several countries. His latest book is The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, and his books have been published in 22 languages. One of his more interesting books was his first one, Coup d'Etat, a practical handbook. This was not only made into a movie, and it's fairly rare for a young author not only to get a book published, but also to have it made into a movie. But I think he achieved something more than the usual author does when he sells a book to Hollywood. The film in which it was made had the British actor Peter O'Toole playing what I consider as the Luttwak role in the movie, the man who carries out the coup. Someone who was lucky enough to meet him 50 years ago when we were both occasional residents at the Middle Common Room in LSE, I can testify that he was really almost all of these things in his early 20s. Now, to respond to his opening remarks, we have a distinguished guest also, Balázs Mártonffy, the director of the Institute for American Studies here at the University of Public Service in Hungary. It's a great delight to have you again here because you're an old regular at our events. I look forward, gentlemen, to your exchanges. Dr. Luttwak, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I should, first of all, I was born in Banat, and Banat was never Hungarian and will never be Romanian. So that's not from Romania, anyone else. And the other thing is that everything you heard, I suppose, is true in some way or another, but the reality is that I have always been a working person, and I have always worked as a military consultant and contractor, which is sometimes telling people how they should fight, and other times doing it. And great fun, and so on. And we have had the opportunities are limited because I don't have large-scale industrial capacity, so I couldn't operate, let's say, the way these contractors did in Iraq. But little wars in Peru, El Salvador, and so on, then you could do them as a contractor. And this is, and that's how I ended up ranching and so on, because I became very interested. I spent a lot of time in the countryside, and I don't actually like agriculture, but raising cows is great stuff. It's a wonderful sort of first. So I want to stick to my narrowest professional activity and talk about this Ukraine war. This Ukraine war started symmetrically because both President Putin and President Biden got exactly the same advice. And the same advice from the intelligence organizations, the Russian one and the American intelligence organization. And the advice was that the Russians will take Kiev in 24 hours, and they will conquer Ukraine in 5 days. Now, if you are the Russian president and you get this information from your intelligence organization and you fail to act to reconquer Ukraine for Russia and restore the Ukrainian-Russian thing, if you fail to do it, when your intelligence tells you that you will win the war in 5 days, and the German chancellor, with the wonderful timing, of course, declares that if there is some fight in Ukraine, he will not stop Nord Stream 2. So this is a big green light. Attack. Your intelligence organization comes and tells you that, imagine that, somebody comes and tells you that all you have to do is to fly to San Francisco, and within 5 days you can become a one of these tycoons, Californian technology tycoons, and you can launch missiles, buy the biggest yachts, and you don't do it, what kind of person you are? So that was the information Putin got. The information that Biden got from the CIA was exactly the same. And it was the CIA information given to the German BND that caused the German chancellor to say, just before, that if there is some fighting, Nord Stream 2 will continue, business will continue. Geschäften is Geschäften. Okay? You don't stop it just because there's a war in Ukraine or so. So given these conditions, what we have then happened was that that war happened, okay? Not the war that the generals, the American generals and the Russian generals were also symmetrical. Also symmetrical because they both fought against Arabs and Afghans in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And therefore, they were exactly the same way as these officers were in 1914. 1914, when the Belgians had fought in Africa, the British in many places, the French in Indochina and Africa. And because of their colonial experience, the fighting was disastrous. It took them about 6 months to realize that anybody who had ever fought in a colonial war was a very dangerous person. Because remember, the Germans were virgins. The Germans had zero experience in 1914. Zero experience. They had not fought at all. Nobody in the German army, not one person had fought in combat. And it was one of the reasons they did very well was because the British and the French, Belgians, they believed they knew about war. The Gerasimov and company, their experiences from Syria, right? Now, with all due respect, I want to respect everybody, but in 1967, I was fighting the Syrians. And I was up in the gap, and we didn't have any equipment because the real army at that time in Israel was fighting in the Sinai. The real army with tanks and everything, all we had was some rifles. But that was enough to fight the Syrians. So this war is shaped by this, and it's shaped by something else. And that is a huge fashion, a moda, fashion for post-kinetic warfare. Post-kinetic. Oh, this old-fashioned kinetic, Achilles hits Hector, Hector hits Achilles, that's kinetic. No, post-kinetic. We're going to use information warfare. We're going to use cyber warfare. The Russians had hybrid warfare. The Americans had fourth-generation warfare. So I would go to meetings in the Pentagon, not one meeting, 100 meetings, surrounded by generals wearing medals of all kinds, and they were talking about war in a way that's fantastical. And my experience of war, it was firing a rifle, using a 2-inch mortar, using a bazooka against a tank, And I was hearing, post-kinetic this and information that and so on and so forth. And the problem was that they were all wearing uniforms and they had all these medals. So I constantly at the meetings has to say, gentlemen, the war is different. In war, they really shoot at you. You don't do post-kinetic. You don't take out your laptop, except. So this is how we entered. That's why I started a Twitter account just before, because the CIA was saying that the Russians will win in 24 hours. They would take Kiev, and I said it would take them 24 weeks, 24 months, perhaps 24 years, but not 24 hours. And the director of the CIA at the time, a wonderful lady, went to the Secretary of Defense to have me fired. So then I tweeted that the CIA director is trying to get me fired as a consultant to the Pentagon, because she is convinced, of course. So this, and then finally, but I believe that both the Americans and the Russians can solve the intelligence problem quite easily. They just have to go to the building in Langley, Virginia, the Americans and the Russians, of course, the FSB headquarters, take everybody out and fumigate to remove the insects, and then bring in Russians who are interested in foreign countries, who have traveled. Many Russians travel, and we even speak a language or two. And Americans who are interested in foreign countries, instead of having the only people in America who don't speak any foreign language. So I was at the Kiev CIA office, and I said, how many of you speak Ukrainian? They said, oh, there's no need to speak Ukrainian. Everybody speaks Russian. So I said, хорошо, я понимаю по-русски. It says, as a matter of fact, I don't, with a nice accent from the South. This is very nice. So this is how the war begins. And this is all documented. If you're interested, you can look at my old tweets. And this is what happened then, not what I'm saying happened now. Then, after that, the failure of the Russian, elegant Russian operation. You land at the Antonov field with some helicopter troops, and then you conquered its airstrip, which is very long and very close to Kiev, much closer than Borispol, the international, the airports. And then you fly in troops with Ilyushins from Russia, and then you grab hold of these vehicles which they send from Belarus, and you drive into Kiev, and you take the city in one day. And of course, Zelensky runs away. Zelensky is a comedian, he runs away, and the government dissolves, and left without orders, the Ukrainians don't fight. Now, the only people in Washington who were saying something different were the sergeants, not the generals, the sergeants, maybe 6 or 7 sergeants who had trained Ukrainians after 2014, trained them. And they managed to reach the chief of staff of the army and told the chief of staff that the intelligence estimate is completely wrong, that the Ukrainians are waiting to fight. Then nobody's going to run away. The fight, of course, they were ignored. That's how we started. What happened after that is attrition. That is, the Russians sent some soldiers to fight against this village or that village. The Ukrainians defend that village or that village. Recently, Bakhmut. But actually, there's been attrition. What is attrition? Attrition is that you have, soldiers on the front. The other side, there's soldiers on the front, and they shoot, and you kill some, they kill some. And this is First World War style. Except in the First World War, they were doing it more seriously with elaborate trench systems, artillery. First World War was very innovative. They developed things like pre-calculated barrages and so on. This is primitive attrition. So the Ukrainians had no choices. The Ukrainian leadership could not decide anything. First, the Russians attacked from Kharkov to Kiev. Then they tried to attack Odessa. And every time, the Ukrainians get some soldiers, some weapons, and go where the Russians are attacking to hold them back. In holding them back, the Ukrainians lose casualties. The Russians also have people dead. But this is attrition at the front, okay? Which means that Kiev cannot decide anything because they're always responding to Russian attack. And the Russians themselves have been handicapped from the first day because Putin refused to declare war. He did not declare war. He did not mobilize the Russian army. He has not sent a single formation of the Russian army into the war. Instead, they were using the professional air assault troops, the desantniki and so on, but they used them very little. And they stopped using them because they were expensive soldiers and they were dying in this kind of war. Then, of course, you all remember they used contract soldiers, people who had served in the Russian Soviet armed forces, Russian armed forces, in any capacity, and who were offered $3,000 a month, which is pretty nice. I mean, I was with the British Army in Borneo, and we got a shilling, 2 shillings a day. I mean, wasn't much. Of course, you couldn't buy anything in Borneo, so it didn't make any difference. But still, the fact is they got contract soldiers. Where did they get them from? Not from Moscow, not from Leningrad, from Petersburg, or even Tatarstan, from Kazan, because in Tatarstan there's oil money. They got them from the very poor areas, from Buryatia, which is on the other side of Mongolia, and from, of course, the Kavkaz and so on, all kinds of people. These people didn't want to fight at all. They wanted to be paid. And they fought that way, as you expect. Then they, of course, had the call-up of reservists. They have 2 million reservists, 2 million. They called up 300,000. About 200,000 showed up, and about 170 were trained. So that's the story everybody knows so far. Then what happens is something else. And that is the Ukrainians are getting better and better. Therefore, they can hold the front without using every soldier. So they start training soldiers, equipping soldiers, but not sending them to the front. And they're accumulating what is called an operational reserve. In continental warfare, the one who wins is the one who has soldiers who are not tied up to defend the street, the house, the village, and the town. And you hold them back, and then you're able to launch an offensive. And that is the situation the Ukrainians are in. The Ukrainians have a body of soldiers who are trained, equipped, and ready, and who are not at the front, who are not tied down to hold back the Russians every day. And so that is why they're talking about an offensive. Now, they have a choice. They can make a choice. One choice would be to limit the risk and to take a sector, a given sector, and launch a limited attack to push the Russians back, like they did before, push them back. And they could do it in different places. They have to choose to do it. Or they can do the big thing. The big thing is to take all these forces, which are not used up, and launch not attacks to push back, but an offensive. An offensive, that is to say, imagine, let's say, the map, Zaporozhye, right? You accumulate forces in Zaporozhye, and then you go to the Black Sea. All the Russians who are west of that line are potentially going to be captured, become prisoners. Very embarrassing. So the Russians have to counterattack. They might do even more ambitiously. Instead of going from Zaporozhye to, let's say, Berdyansk on the Black Sea, they could even go to Mariupol. That would be capturing a lot of Russians will be cut off, cutting the roads and railway lines that are supplying the Russians who are in the south of the Dnieper, all along the Dnieper. In other words, the geography of the Dnieper River offers clear potential use. So this is a wonderful thing that could happen. Suddenly, instead of First World War, we get to Second World War. That is to say, big battles, the front changes. So the journalists don't have to complain that every day they're reporting from Bakhmut that another house fell or didn't fall, and so on. Be an interesting war movement. Now, the only problem is this, that the Russians might be doing also something. Because the Russians did call up these reservists and did not use them. And they have some other troops that didn't engage. Somewhere or other, there are about 120,000, 150,000 Russians who are not at the front, who are their operational reserve. So this gives the Ukrainians yet another choice. They can say, okay, let's wait for the Russians to attack, and then we counterattack. Counterattack is a good thing because the enemy has already shown his game. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that instead of having this war continuing the way it has, we may see in the next, between now and let's say October, a different kind of war, where the Ukrainians try to cut off a lot of Russians, and the Russians try to do something else. The one thing is, unfortunately, for both sides, is that the Ukrainians cannot actually drive to Moscow and conquer the Kremlin. They can't do that. And the Russians themselves now can't go to Kiev because a Russian maneuver is possible, but if it ends up in Kiev, then instead of getting a victory, like driving to Berlin, you're going to get Stalingrad, because Kiev is now full of Ukrainians who are very truculent, very determined to fight, and they have lots of weapons, and lots of housewives have bazookas. It's just a fact. There are lots of bazookas lying around, RPGs, LAVs, light anti-tank weapons. One of the nice things that happened in this war was that I wrote a book called The Logic of War and Peace, okay? And the logic in question is paradoxical. In war, everything is paradoxical, right? In peacetime, if you want to go from Budapest to Vienna, you take the best road, and you go. In wartime, you go best road, they wait for you, okay? So the good road is bad, the bad road is good. Contradiction everywhere, paradox everywhere in war. That's why the history of wars is a history of failures and disasters, because the logic is wrong. So, for example, poor Putin said, of course I have to attack Ukraine. NATO is very weak. The French are talking about replacing the NATO completely. NATO is so weak and so on. The reason NATO was weak was because NATO didn't have a real enemy. The Russians supplied the real enemy, and so because NATO was weak, the Russians attacked NATO. Because the Russians attacked NATO, NATO becomes strong. This paradox and contradiction is typical of all wars in all situations. And so now we are in that stage where we might have an evolution of this war from First World War to Second World War. And if there's a Second World War, you cannot end like Second World War because the Russians can't go to Kiev, the Ukrainians can't go to Moscow. But what can happen is the political shift. Because, for example, if a Russian army of 80,000 people or 100,000 people is able to, outmaneuver the Ukrainian forces, and there's a catastrophe, and the NATO ministers have to decide whether to send soldiers to NATO or not, suddenly there could be a political solution, as they call it, which is making concessions on Donetsk and Luhansk and so on. On the other hand, if a Russian army is cut off, let's say the Ukrainians were to do the simple thing, they go from Zaporozhye, a big force, reach the Black Sea and cut the roads and rails, and all the Russians there are stuck. And, they cannot survive without being resupplied and so on. Such a thing could happen, and it would be a humiliating debacle. And so Putin can survive a failing war, but he might not survive politically a humiliation debacle. For the Russians to be humiliated by Germans in 1941-42 was okay for Stalin, but for Putin, if the Ukrainians pull off an offensive, and the offensive is successful with this kind of cut-off offensive, with a lot of Russians left, then political changes happen. So I believe personally that there's a kind of 50-50 possibility that the war will end the way wars should end, with war deciding the outcome. There's different configurations, how it's happened. Right now, it seems more likely that the Ukrainians will do it, but remember, there's somewhere or other, there is this Russian army that is now fighting. And you remember that what's happened in the last few months is that they were using Wagner mercenaries to fight. Where were they fighting? In one place, Bakhmut. And who was fighting? Not the professional airborne troops, not the recalled reservists, not even the contract regiments. Fighting is Wagner. So what the other Russians are doing, somewhere or other, there are these 120, 50,000 Russians who are in, they're soldiers with equipment and everything, and they've been silent for months. So both sides have been withholding soldiers to do a big blow. So and one can hope that there'll be a solution out of this. The only thing I can tell you is that Ukrainians are Europeans. And they are Europeans who've had the typical European experience, which is to be in a war where a lot of people get killed and a lot of buildings are destroyed. After that, such a war, they will immediately make lots of children. The girls and boys will all get together. There'll be big upsurge in children. They're going to rebuild the buildings, and Ukraine is going to be a great place. Any country that is attacked and successfully defends itself by a big power then has energy for the next 60 years or 90 years. And so, and as you know, the lack of vitality in Western Europe, the lack of vitality in Europe is because somebody took away the engine of European life, which was war. That was the engine of European life. You have a war, things get destroyed, and then after the war, men like war, women like warriors. There's a population upsurge, and then there's enormous energy and construction. Just look, Japan had a huge army in China. Japan sent troops everywhere. Japan did this and that, but the population of Japan in 1955 was much higher than in 1939. Even though they lost civilians, they lost military and everything else. So we're going to see this in Ukraine, and maybe Ukraine will be a model. So, that would be to get out of this kind of lethargy, There are possible wars. For example, you could reconquer Banat. That would be, a nice war and so on. Good, I'll end with that.
Do you want to stay there or speak from I now invite a respondent to respond. Dr. Mártonffy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Luttwak, for enlightening thoughts. I'm not sure what I can add on the physical side of the war, the kinetic portion of it, other than to say that was a superb assessment of what happened, and I agree with 99% of what was said, especially on the shared intelligence assessment, which proved to be incorrect, the perceptions and the misperceptions that guided this thing, the highlighting of Nord Stream 2 as a key symbol and bridge and energy and geopolitical pipeline over there. That's very important. So all I can say is the first side of the title says the easy military questions. These are not easy military questions. Dr. Luttwak just made it easy for us to understand it. So that was great. Thank you so much. Very complex going into there. So I think what's left for me is to highlight the hard cultural questions of that. So I'll try to speak very briefly about 3 other wars that are going on in my view. And I think fundamentally the reason we can speak about these other wars that are ongoing is because of what Dr. Luttwak said, is that Russia can't get to Kiev and Ukraine can't get to Moscow. And there's more than just the fact that Ukraine can't get to Moscow. There are very clear limitations as to how far they can push the military angle into potentially Russian territory and whatnot, with the whole nuclear dimension, the NATO dimension, and the complexity over there. So that is why I think we can speak a little bit about the war that is fought on other fronts. So I'll just offer 3 other wars that I highlighted as Dr. Luttwak was speaking. The first war was the physical, the kinetical, the physics-guided, the world of facts, in the sense that bullets terminate life and their facts are sort of clear. The second war that's ongoing is the war of narratives. What do these facts mean? Which facts do we highlight? And there we can clearly see that Ukraine, at least in the Western world, is winning the war of narratives. Ukraine has a stronger, more appealing, and I'll highlight this in my personal view as we get to war number 4, a more just portion of that, but we can get to how much that matters in wars of narrative. Russia's narrative, calling it a special military operation, doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny. It's a war, for lack of a better term. The denazifying portion is very complicated to sell in Europe in any way, shape, or form. So I think it's not quite winning the war of narrative. The third war that's ongoing is a framing war. So not just about what's going on the facts of the ground, not the physics facts, not what those facts mean, what the narrative is, but what ought to be done. Framing, how you conceptualize what is going on. Because one view, and I'm oversimplifying here, is that war is a natural part of human life, the engine of previous things and their goods and bads that go with it, but it's a natural portion of that. The other framing conceptual reality, which the United States does for different purposes, and we can get into that later, is that no, it's not a natural thing, saying that after he has won his major wars. It's something that can be abolished through what I call liberal universal ideas, sort of the democratic peace theory, and it's over there. The framing war, especially in most of Europe, is being won by the United States, less by Ukraine. It's not quite involved in this macro framing war of what ought to be done with certain facts that we've selected that construe a narrative about what's really happening in the physical world. And the fourth war, I'll briefly highlight, is the war of purpose. And fundamentally, how you answer what's really going on in human life is how you will then answer the framing war, the narrative war, and the physical core questions. And over here, the question is it really two states fighting? Is this a proxy war? Is this a semi-proxy war? Is this something that goes against universal human nature, right? And these questions about what is purpose really fundamentally gets into, is the West a self-selection idea of closely aligned values, or is it a metapolitical construct? Is it a metapolitical entity? Or is it just, based off of some comments who would say that NATO is nothing else but North America and the others, an instrument of US foreign policy? And how you answer this war of purpose really answers the other three. So I think I sort of touched on the hard cultural questions, important ones over there, but that's response. Great presentation by Dr. Luttwak.
Thank you very much, Balázs. Can I have a preliminary response from you?
Yes, evidently, for the diplomats and policymakers, the war of narratives is very important because they deal with the press every day. But I began by pointing out that there was this major misunderstanding about the very nature of war that generals shared in. Namely, that it was all going to be cyber, it's all going to be this, it's all going to be that. It will be everything other than stupid things like people shooting people with rifles and people attacking tanks with tanks and so on. They were so convinced of it that in the United States, we went down to having a single factory making gunpowder. Okay, one factory. Because, we have iPhones and we have laptops, that kind of stuff. So in that sense, the war of narratives is important, but the war of narratives is also not important. For example, because of the war of narratives, etc., being won by the West, even the Italian government, for example, is supporting fully the war in Ukraine, even though it's a coalition which includes two parties that are opposed to that. However, if you go to the Italian government and you ask them and you say to them, you've been sending weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. The Ukrainians are running out of soldiers. How many soldiers are you willing to send? The answer is none. Okay? So you gain the support of the Italian government by having a very good narrative. I'm talking from Washington's point of view, but you're not going to get them over. The narrative will not actually get them to do more than that. A good narrative will persuade people to go to the restaurant. It will persuade them to go to the cinema. It will not persuade them to go and dig in the fields or let alone fight. So that is a matter of focus.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask myself, both our speakers, some questions. At a certain point, I'll hand that duty over to all of you. But the first question, which I'll ask to Dr. Luttwak, is what impact is this war having in the long term, do you think, on the structure of NATO? I notice, for example, that there seems to have developed in a kind of a semi-formal way an alliance between the Brits, the Poles, the Swedes, the Ukrainians, the Balts, and there's a kind of northern tier of NATO. There are actually some defense agreements on which this is based. But do you see that as anything other than a brief temporary arrangement, or do you see it persisting in some way?
Well, I do it, but please notice what's going on, okay? You have there are countries like Estonia which are indefensible, okay? Indefensible. It simply is a matter of geography and so on. Then there are countries like Poland which are highly defensible but refuse to defend themselves. I don't know if you're, I'm going to tell you this because it's something that still shocks me to this day. On November 4, 2021, November 4, 2021, which I admit is a long time ago because it's before the war, I was invited to Warsaw, not like here. I was invited professionally by the presidency and the advisors, and they paid me my usual fee, okay? Which is buy a motor car with that fee, okay? Cheap car, okay, not an expensive car. I arrived there in Warsaw, and just before leaving, the Polish embassy supplied me with a data sheet. So I read off the data sheet when I arrived. There was all the advisors there, all of them. The president was not there, but it was chief of staff of the army, everybody. And I said, look, I have a data sheet in front of me. And according to this data sheet, which is not propaganda because it was given to me by your embassy, you have 42,000 trained soldiers. Now, since I know that you have 42,000 trained soldiers, but I am not good at geography, I have to use that datum of 42,000 soldiers to know where Poland is. And since you have 42,000 soldiers, you must be between Fiji and Tonga. Because if you are not between Fiji and Tonga, and you are, let's say, only 2,000, 3,000 kilometers from Moscow, and you have 42,000 soldiers, then what's going on in this country? And then I said to them something else. You're buying F-35s. F-35s are absolutely wonderful airplanes. Wonderful airplanes. But you're buying the airplanes, but you're only buying 10 missiles per airplane, which means you're planning to fight an air war that will last one morning and one afternoon. And then I noticed that you're buying very expensive helicopters. Why the hell do you need expensive helicopters? Answer, because when we send our Polish troops on peacekeeping missions, we don't want them to be ashamed of their old Soviet helicopters. So I told them, I was using Soviet helicopters flying around Latin America because they were much easier to maintain than the American helicopters. There's nothing wrong with them. If you don't like the paint, you can repaint them. But all of this happened on November 4, 2021, which is a long time ago, before the war. I noticed that now there's been a war, and Poland still does not have national military service, still does not have conscription. But you'll notice that Finland, which has 5.5 million inhabitants, at the assembly of the army, they were supposed to have 425,000 reservists and active duty, of course. Instead, they got 580,000 because the reservists refused not to show up. And they arrived anyway. That is why a country like Finland, when the Finnish prime minister, that wonderful woman who unfortunately, is the most beautiful woman in the world, she said that Finland will go into NATO. One of Putin's friends said, we have to, and the answer not from some journalist, but from the deputy chief of staff of the Finnish army, the answer is, we have 50,000 dead Russians buried in Finland. But Finland is actually a big country. We have room for many more. That's the last time they made such a statement. Why? Because they have deterrence. And deterrence because they have Finnish soldiers and they have a realistic war plan. Not the plan of our British friends, who are trying to be very nice, but they have no way of defending these countries. They are giving them illusions of defense. The Finnish plan is, our border with Russia is 1,300 kilometers long. We cannot possibly hold the Russians. We can't hold the Russians. Therefore, our policy is to let them invade wherever they want to invade. Once they've invaded across Lapland, because Lapland is quite big, actually, then the Finnish army arrives and will kill Russians. So the Finnish soldier is not trained to defend Finland, because that's not realistic. He's trained to kill Russians. That's why each soldier is also issued with a knife, a long knife. Because, you get the sentry, you just kill him with a knife. That's a nice thing to do because he doesn't shoot and so on. In other words, you can be European, you can be high income, you can be an advanced society, and you can have a realistic defense. But not if you're buying frigates. The Poles were buying frigates in the Baltic. Say, why the hell are you spending $557 million to buy a surface ship that can't do anything except being sunk? And he said, well, we are a Baltic naval power. I said, why don't you be a Hawaiian, Polynesian? Why don't you operate in Polynesia to protect the Polynesian islands, from illegal shipping, illegal fishing by the Chinese. That would be a mission you can do. But you can't operate in the Baltic. So in other words, you can be Finland or you can be Poland, okay? But the Finnish formula appears to be having a bonus effect. And the bonus effect is when you have a high morale, that morale spills over into civilian life.
That's an obvious question, but when you said these things to the Poles, what did they reply?
They gave me wonderful arguments. But you see, their arguments, I could not ridicule and dismiss their arguments because their arguments were made before the war, okay? Before the war. A Polish newspaper, somebody in this meeting leaked the information, some information, and the Polish paper ran an article because somebody leaked something about, there was somebody there who spoke, right? And the leak was a complete misrepresentation because I had told the Poles that if they start national military service tomorrow, within 4 months, they could have 1.5 million new soldiers being trained who could already do some things. They couldn't do elaborate operations, but for example, they could fire a bazooka at the Russian tank. And this was misrepresented in the leak, saying that I said that somehow rather that in 4 months there'd be a war. Of course, I had no idea whatsoever that there would be a war of 4 months from November 4, 2021. I had no idea at all. So this was a very interesting case of misrepresentation, which gave a kind of false prophetic thing to this article, which the Polish press somehow is all over the internet and is based on a complete lie, because I had zero idea. It never occurred to me that the Russians could possibly do such a terrible thing as to invade Europe's biggest country with a tiny army of 120. There were 132,000 soldiers, including dentists, in that lineup. Okay, including dentists. When they invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, Czechoslovakia is 1/5 the size of Ukraine and had 1/4 of the population. The invasion of the Warsaw Pact, including Hungarian troops, was 800,000 soldiers. So the first night there were 400,000 soldiers in Czechoslovakia. The second night, 800,000. That's a good number. And by the way, the Russians could have invaded with 800,000. They could have. But they didn't bother to do it because the CIA and the FSB told them that Zelensky would run away, the Ukrainian government would dissolve, and the Ukrainians left without orders would surrender, and then they would see all these images on their iPhones showing the Russian tanks rolling in, and they would look at these images and surrender. The idea that they would drop the phone on the ground and start shooting never occurred to me.
Balázs, would you like to respond to that? And then I have a question to you.
Just very quickly, because I'm a political scientist, so I frame things in sort of political science-y terms. I do apologize for that. I apologize to my wife on a daily basis, but that's what sort of comes to mind. When you were talking about the Finnish idea of how to defend, right? It wasn't at the border. And it's very...
You just attack Russians.
Which is in political...
You tell a soldier, you don't have to defend your country, you just have to kill a Russian. Just have to kill a Russian, that's your duty.
Which in political science terms is what you call deterrence by punishment. You're not trying to stop them, you're trying to incur a cost high enough that they refrain from the initial action whatsoever. The problem with deterrence by punishment, it's a very hard political sell, right? For most politicians...
To whom it is a hard political
to your
sell?
domestic public, usually.
To the Finns?
For the Finns themselves, who've already had a long war with the Soviet Union, and I think they came out relatively well, even though they lost their territory, they have a nice sense of this works, right? You can get something done over there.
Right.
For many other NATO members, where the norm of territorial sovereignty is strongly ingrained in us, as in your tanks shouldn't cross over to my border, this is a hard sell. So what you have to do is deterrence by denial. Try to get a defense where you stop the enemy tank from coming over. Much more costly, much more problematic, and all that different stuff. But
Defense
this was
by denial means you have to defend your border, right? And like the Chinese Great Wall and so on, which never worked, by the way, for China, but you can do that. I mean, I understand. This is definitely, it's a hard sell because it involves a population that knows itself and has a high regard for its country, okay? The Finns are highly patriotic. One reason they're highly patriotic is because their leaders never asked them to do unrealistic and fantastical things. Their leaders always asked them to do very elementary things, like defend yourself, things like that. You know.
I want to go back to you, but just on that narrow point, do you think that's also true of any of the Baltic states? I'm thinking particularly of the Estonians, where you get the impression that the Estonians are actually prepared to fight and die.
I've only been to Estonia once because it was a consultation and so on. They also used my strategy book in the military education, military colleges. So you are absolutely correct. The problem with the Estonians is that they fail in a bedroom. They fail in a bedroom. There are very few Estonians. They don't have enough children. The army doesn't have enough soldiers. The country is too small. Half the population are ethnic Russians. So the Estonians, you can have the will to fight without the means to fight. I think you're probably right that they would like to fight, but they just can't do it. They're not defensible. The Poles could be defensible for demographic reasons. Hungary is defensible because it could do it. I mean, if somebody were to threaten Hungary, but nobody's going to threaten Hungary, that's for sure. I mean,
well, that's the question I wanted to put actually to Balázs, because I wanted to move our focus geographically down to Central Europe and say, as a result of this war, in which we know Hungary has had a clear, consistent policy of wanting to see it end as quickly as possible and saying, it's not our war. As members of NATO, we will support collective actions, but we won't go beyond them. And rhetorically, there is obviously a fairly, a strong line in favor of peace and negotiations as quickly as possible. But what impact, in your view, has the war had, and the Russian actions particularly, on the thinking of the political and military elites in Hungary in particular, but obviously in its neighbors too?
Well, I think fundamentally, my work is on alliance cohesion, my political science work. I've always looked at when do alliances come together and when do alliances fall apart. And we've seen that Russian threat, as long as it wasn't large enough or specific enough, didn't really drive NATO together. I think fundamentally, if you look at the NATO level outcomes, you see that this further aggression, as the US likes to style it, I just call it the war, really has brought NATO together. It made NATO stronger, as Dr. Luttwak mentioned over. Alliance cohesion has grown. Hungary, I think, in Hungary's logic, has been sufficiently smart to not detract from alliance cohesion, even though its own interests may be different, mainly because in Hungary there's very low threat perception of Russia. This has been the case for the past little over a decade, I would say. Contrary to the threat perception in Poland or Estonia of Russia,
or Romania.
Or Romania, where it's very high. And if you just basically look at this as a very simple realist story of threat perception and interest maximization, it makes perfect sense for Hungary to behave this way if the threat perception of Russia is low, and if fundamentally it believes NATO is a sufficiently strong security guarantee. But on the other hand, and I think for the past 10 years, you can see from a military defensive perspective, an alliance cohesion perspective, very commendable Hungarian policies of strengthening the Hungarian defense forces, large modernization actions, which have been in place even without the war happening. And I think this is because the Hungarian elite, and responding directly to your question, the foreign policy elite, has realized that the world is going towards multipolarity. And multipolarity, meaning the United States is no longer the single great power in the system. There's a rising China, there are rising regional powers. Multipolarity means more instability, more volatility, and higher risk. And fundamentally, these mean that each nation state or each nation has to be able to defend itself and in cohesion with its allies, but itself as well. Which is why I think you see the very well commendable Hungarian defense forces buildup, which were in place even without the war. The war was sort of a catalyst moment for the Hungarian modernization, not a catharsis moment. So even though I don't think the war was expected to break out, I don't think there was an expectation, it fits in with the Hungarian, again, bad political sciencey word, ontological, meaning our worldview of what's going on, and that's why the modernization it didn't start, it just picked up its pace.
Any response to you on that geographical sector?
Sorry?
On the impact of the war on Hungary and Central Europe?
Well, you just heard that Hungary was on a certain course. The war just increased it. It's a course of which is developing military forces without any imagined purpose for them, without any purpose for them. That is, it's an interesting proposition. You're going to a parliament and you're asking for money to build up the military forces because the military forces are in a poor shape. Many tanks don't work and so on. Nobody in parliament says, who are you going to fight? Who are you going to fight? Because unfortunately, all the good candidates are NATO members, so you can't fight them. So that
Maybe not so
the Russians, because of the kindness of Hitler and Stalin, the map of Hungary was changed, so that you don't have the part of Hungary that would be closer to that conflict area is now Ukraine. I mean, one scheme for Hungary would be to change sides and to attack Ukraine to get back Munkacs, where the Hungarians were. Where was the Hungarian territory? What? Arcapatska Rus, the Russians call it. Subcarpathian Ruthenia, and the population there were not actually Magyars. There were some Magyars, but there were many more non-Magyars in that territory, right? So that would be a purpose. So, but I mean, look, at some point, somebody in this picture, you see, what happened at the beginning was that there used to be a big Soviet army with lots of tanks that were ready to roll all the way to Calais. And that is when the Americans and the British, because at that time it was still a partnership, Americans and British, they developed the whole of NATO to stop the Soviet army rolling to Calais. Okay, that area is over. Now there is a different area, and the question is if Hungary's military buildup is in context of NATO, as because of the rewards of alliance, then it's all makes sense. But ultimately, there has to be a scenario somewhere. In a picture, there has to be a scenario. The British solved this problem historically for 200 years because they had acquired some colonies. So there was Colony A. The problem with Colony A is that this border was unstable because next to it, it was not a British colony. So the colonial office said, to secure this country, lower Cabinda, we have to conquer Eastern Cabinda. Once you conquer Eastern Cabinda, then of course you have a new border. That border is unstable because they're still savages, so you become one. So there was a logic to it. Somebody somewhere has to have this logic, okay? Now, the countries that are very fortunate and very lucky are the countries around China, because the Indians know exactly why they're doing a big military buildup, which is to fight the Chinese. The Japanese have done a significant change, and they also plan to fight the Chinese. Okay, and the Australians have decided that, contrary to what may seem, because it takes 15 hours to fly from Beijing to Melbourne, they decided that they're next door to China too. So they're getting a little serious about doing this. They're Australians, so they're not really serious, but half serious. So somebody somewhere has to have a real scenario, okay? And I don't see a scenario for a country like Hungary unless you're on a track where, having supported loyally NATO, the moment comes when you're willing to send troops to fight in Ukraine. If you do not have that as a projection of this situation, you don't actually have a strong logic for what you're doing.
I think you need to come back on this, and then I'll throw open one question.
Right.
More question.
I'm not really sure how I can comment on the future, except I think we're fundamentally, Dr. Luttwak and I's assessment of what's going on in the world, in the military world, is very similar. It's a threat-based situation. It's not singularly a power-based situation. You respond to threats. And where my previous comments came in on the war of framing, the war of narrative, and the war of purpose is what constitutes a threat. And that's a very interesting cultural question, which we can get to in the audience portion. But what I did want to respond directly is, I used to work for the Ministry of Defense a little over a decade ago, and I worked for the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. And I remember distinctly what Dr. Luttwak mentioned is that no matter how creative my speeches got, which I wrote for the minister when he went into parliament and said, we need more money, they clapped a little louder, but never gave any more money. So it's fundamentally, you need to have a vision for what the armed forces are potentially for. And this is where I would nuance Dr. Luttwak's comments over here. I think the potentially for, that idea that this is no longer a world in which the liberal promise of American unipolarity will hold no matter what, that conclusion has been reached by the Hungarian government a number of years ago, and they're responding to that. It's not my understanding, and I may be wrong, of course, is not that they want to take on risks, my understanding, military risks per se, but they want to be able to mitigate any risks should they come and deter in a somewhat former reverse logic of arms control in this way.
I now want to come to the mothership of NATO, so to speak, which is Washington. And I want to ask this question. Washington is now facing a world in which it has potentially two wars, one in Asia, one in Europe, being waged at the same time. It also has a situation in which it has allies in both, but allies of different levels of commitment, and in case of Asia, allies which they are making every day at the moment, it would appear, in order to create a more a stronger, stable balance of resistance to China. So how do you think at this moment the strategic debate is going to, how will it end in Washington? Because they have some very hard questions to answer, and they've got an election coming up in which, for the first time for a long time, there are real differences of opinion in the American electorate about what the right course of action is.
Well, a difference of opinion up to a point, because a lot of people, there are many people in the United States who are not happy with sending money to Ukraine. They're all terribly happy about doing anything against the Chinese. So this is not a new thing, it's a replay, because actually the so-called, there were people before the Second World War, isolationists in the United States. Some isolationists were simply isolationists. And others were people saying, we want to fight in Asia, we don't want to fight in Europe, and so on. Now, the big thing, the big difference is that in Asia, American diplomacy, to be an American diplomat in the whole of Asia means that you can spend a lot of time going to excellent restaurants and enjoying yourself. And I personally adore snorkeling and scuba diving. And whenever I go, I go to Palawan Island off Philippines, which is a wonderful place for snorkeling. A lot of American diplomats from Japan, Korea, you can do that because the people who are working day and night to build the alliance are the Chinese. The Chinese are building the alliance. Every time the Indians are wavering, the Chinese launch another attack up in Ladakh on the northwest thing, and if they get bored with Ladakh, they launch an attack on the northeast side, Arunachal Pradesh, and sometimes, just to add spice, they attack in Sikkim. So every time the Indians are wavering, the Chinese, boom, attack them. When the Japanese, the only time in post-1945 Japanese history that the LPD, the conservative pro-American party, was not ruling Japan. It was the New Democratic Party, which believed in going more neutral and disengaging from the United States. That's when the Chinese started the Senkaku dispute by causing a huge incident over this tiny island at the very end of Japan, Senkaku. They call it Yaotuyai. If you call it Senkaku in Beijing, they arrest you and give you 7 years. You have to call it Yaotuyai. They exactly when the first time ever there was a neutralist thing, and they sent the defense minister to Beijing with lots of people, and they signed 36 memoranda for Japan and China to cooperate militarily with exchanges, officer exchanges, all kinds of stuff. That's when the Chinese decided to make a big issue, Senkaku, create an incident, and propagandize it in China so that individual Japanese businessmen were attacked in the streets in China. So when you have a country like China, then the diplomats can really go snorkeling because the Chinese built the alliance. We don't have a NATO. We don't have a huge mass of bureaucrats in shape in Brussels. We don't have any treaties. We don't have anything. And the alliance is organic and real and increases every damn day. Every time I go to India, first the foreign ministry explains that India is not in conflict with China. These are minor border incidents. And then you go across the street and you find out that they sent another 60,000 troops on the Ladakh border. Between one incident and the other, 60,000 soldiers. So, people like that. And finally, for them to pick a quarrel with Australia. Okay, Australia is a country which had a prime minister who spoke perfect Chinese, among other things, and the Australians were, of course, exporting all the, natural gas and liquefied natural gas and coal and everything else, wine and so on. Everything was absolutely wonderful. And then what happened was that they started provoking trouble with the Australians. And what was their number one request is that the Australian government should shut down the Institute of Strategic Studies in Canberra, the capital of Australia, because it is anti-Chinese. So the Chinese diplomacy is so advanced, so sophisticated. It is an ancient culture, as you know, 5,000 years of defeats, by the way, but that's a minor point. But the point is that they go to the government of Australia and demand that it closes an Institute of Strategic Studies because it's anti-Chinese. Now, so that's why, as I say, doing alliance diplomacy in Asia for the United States is nothing. You just wait for the next Chinese faux pas. But then the final thing, of course, is Taiwan. As you know, the Chinese offer to Taiwan is one country, but two systems. You keep all your freedoms, everything that you're there, and you can do everything, and it's wonderful and so on. Now, so there is a guy upstairs, and there's a beautiful girl in the street, and the guy upstairs says, come upstairs. And you'll be very nice, it'll be wonderful and so on. But there's a problem. There's another girl, not the girl Taiwan, the girl Hong Kong. And the girl Hong Kong is under one country, two systems. And what happens is that she hears screams from Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong is upstairs. The Chinese say, come upstairs. In the meantime, the Hong Kong is screaming and trying to get out of the place. So people, again, dealing with the Chinese is much easier than dealing with the Russians. Because the Russians make mistakes, but the Chinese only make mistakes.
Thank you. Would you want to comment at all on that?
Very short comments on sort of very interesting threat perceptions, how the Chinese are building their own anti-coalition against them. And that is fundamentally the question is why, right? I think it was Napoleon who once said that war is too important to be left to the generals, right? So when the general looked at the military situation and saw Japan wavering and going off the pro-America course, they said, don't do anything. But the domestic political pressure was, ooh, weak, let's capitalize on it. Let's do the Senkaku Diayotu debate and all that stuff. So that's very interesting. On the Australia front, I think they're a little stronger. They're doubling down on the U.S. We'll see how much they waver over there. But back to my original point, it seems the Chinese are also trying to fight the narrative and the framing war, right? Why other demand to shut down the Institute for Strategic Studies in Canberra, if not that? Those people will not cease to give advice to the government if that's the case, but they do want to win the narrative war. And here's where, back to John's original question on what is Washington up to, here's the important question of what does Washington do with its idea of spheres of influence? Because most of the world has worked in spheres of influence ways up until the end of the Cold War, right? It was very clear, great power, subsidiarity, everyone else behaves the way I do, exclusivity, other great powers don't meddle in my affairs. But after the end of the Cold War, 4 subsequent US presidents from both parties have said, we've passed the world of spheres of influence. We've gone past it. History has surpassed it. And what we have seen, of course, is this was coupled with a US preponderance of power raising. But now, US power is declining, multipolarity is back, but they're stuck with this narrative of we've gone past spheres of influence. And I think this will be a critical choice in Washington, and the debate is ongoing, what to do with this war of framing, in my view, and war of purpose, because that's how you can figure out how much resources to devote to the actual, do you counter China, do you counter China military, do you build up your alliances through political means, and what do you do with Europe and the easy military questions and the hard cultural questions?
May I just say one thing? We have a particular problem today in Washington because President Biden is extremely experienced and knowledgeable. He is, don't laugh, he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. He would hold very serious hearings. He invited very serious people to speak. He paid serious attention. The problem is that he has no staffers. The Biden people are all dead. He's old. They're all dead. So the people who are in his White House are Obama people and Clinton people. They have no idea about international politics. In fact, they tried very hard and almost succeeded in destroying relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia, simply because some fat slob of a Muslim fanatic who wrote 3 columns to the Washington Post was killed in a very unprofessional way in Istanbul. I mean, I went to school in Sicily, so you can imagine my outrage at this unprofessional killing. There are 30 ways of killing Khashoggi, 30 ways, and they picked the bad one. So the thing is that because of that, I mean, I'll share with you something confidential, I suppose. I was in Saudi 6 days before the president arrived. So I arrive in Riyadh, I go to see the foreign minister, and I say, show me the agenda for the summit meeting. He had no agenda because to the last minute, these people in the White House who are working for Biden, but don't actually like Biden, they wanted Hillary and so on. These people were trying to sabotage the meeting. They wanted him to arrive in Jeddah to meet, he didn't meet just the Saudi, he met the other Gulfies and so on. And he wanted him to punch Mohammed bin Salman. So they ended up with this stupid, they were sabotaging. So we have problems in Washington. The Chinese problem is that they're Chinese, which means they have no idea about the outside world at all. They have no idea. They're zero. All they know how to do in Europe are things like corrupting Italian politicians. But corrupting Italian politicians, you don't have to be intelligent. You just need money, They can't do anything else in Europe. They were trying to get they tried by a midnight operation to get the European Union to accept the investment pact, remember? And dropping the clauses about trade union rights and no slave labor in Xinjiang. They tried to pull it off by doing it on December 31st. So, this is the kind of tricks they learned from this guy they have, this Schunzer, this moron, who wrote this book that says the war is tricks. Okay, that's what they have. But we have our problems too. The problem we have is that we have a dislocation in the White House.
I'm going to ask you one question before we're going over to the floor. and it's this. What are the strategic consequences, and what should they be, of the fact that we don't seem to be afraid of Russia anymore?
Yeah, there are lots of nuclear weapons around. The Russians dust them off. They even they have these hypersonic missiles. So the hypersonic missiles are supposed to have a nuclear warhead, but unfortunately, these games don't work. And the problem is one that the Americans encountered a long time ago in Korea. When the winter of 1950, the Chinese army suddenly arrived in Korea and attacked. There was an attempt to invoke nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, nuclear weapons, under the logic of strategy, the logic of war, which is always paradoxical, nuclear weapons were born too powerful to be useful. Too powerful to be useful. Go to Putin and say, listen, you keep talking about nuclear weapons. Why don't you drop one? Okay? Why don't you have a little one? They used to have little backpack nuclear weapons for sabotaging bridges. Why don't you detonate one of those? And Putin would react like you're going to a Victorian lady and suggest that she go without a bra in the Regent Park. No, nuclear weapon. But periodically they try to do it, you know. The problem in nuclear weapons is they're too powerful to be useful. And one reason, by the way, why the Russian Air Force is so weak is because the American Air Force, unilaterally, without any treaty, without any agreement, got rid of nuclear weapons to reduce them to a very, very small number of symbolic nuclear weapons, which are held in very symbolic places like Aviano in northeast Italy for NATO and so on. They got rid of nuclear weapons because having nuclear weapons prevented you from having the actual space on the airplanes to have non-nuclear weapons, which are the good ones that you can actually use. What's the point of flying a bigger pilot and having weapons if you can't even drop the bombs? I mean, you know, you've had a hard day at the office, so to speak, and at least you can bomb a city. But the Russians can't because they built a nuclear air force. See, and that's why they have such limited capacity.
Thank you very much. Unless you want to come in, let me throw this open now to the floor. Who would like to ask the first question? A gentleman here and then here.
Thank you. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Can the United States regain its primacy in the world after Biden has decimated it? And what would it take?
Yeah, but it has to be done within the sphere. This is to regain primacy, the United States has to solve its own internal problems, okay? If you open the pages of the New York Times, every single day there is another outrageous discovery that there are no transgender astronauts. No transgender astronauts. How come there are no transgender astronauts? It's because of bias and prejudice and hatred and all that stuff. So that is, okay, that's one thing. In other words, the United States, evidently this war is not a serious enough war to have focused. Many Americans are convinced, as you know, from everyday news, that is much more important to deal with the problem of the lack of transgender submariners. Now, you may think that's a joke, but actually there is a big pressure. And the U.S. Navy submariners are getting under great pressure, and they're resisting. They're saying, we don't want transgender submariners. Because, you go to the toilet and there's somebody there who appears, that kind of stuff. Okay? In a submarine, it's a submarine. It's not like being in a Sahara desert. It's a submarine. And I don't know how many of you have ever experienced being in a submarine, but it's like, everybody you're living in basically, the same room. So if the United States gets out of it, the problem with the Americans, I'm sure all of you know, is that America was actually ruled quite well by the British. King George III was notoriously a humanitarian, humanist person. It was British. They rebelled against King George. They had started the revolution, and unfortunately for them, the revolution never ends. It just changes direction, changes direction. I mean, and then they inflict the problem on the whole world. You may not know this, but the whole American culture was pushing cigarette smoking because cigars were so unpleasant. And ladies had to abandon the dinner table because men would light up cigars, they said, have cigarettes. Then you can actually sit at the table and smoke, and your wife can be there, and they don't have to run away. So the Americans were going all around the world saying, smoke cigarettes. And then by the time they reached the furthest places, like Papua New Guinea, they had turned against cigarettes. So the guys in Papua New Guinea, the last ones to start smoking cigarettes, suddenly they're told, don't smoke cigarettes. So the problem with having a permanent revolution, you see, the subject changes, but always trying to and occasionally they operate internationally. So operating on the world scene is a part-time activity. You know, it's like somebody is a lawyer, but part-time he also goes hunting ducks. That's how foreign policy is done in America.
Well, thank you. The gentleman here.
First of all, congratulations, exceptional presentation. And you're very refreshing, to say the least. It's close to funny. One comment. Australia and China, connection to the Solomon Islands, as we know, and this is how the Australians suddenly see the Chinese coming on the border. On Adnan Khashoggi, he was representative of Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, and I both note that MBS was not happy, Muslim Brotherhood. I want to go back to the elephant in the room, and that's the nuclear question. We live very close. I happen to be involved in radiation monitoring, preparations, and so on. It is true that Putin comes up with the subject. What's the chance, do you think, of an EM, an electromagnetic one, if he wants to get to Transnistria to pick up the weapons of the 14th Army? You know what I mean. And then the other one is Iran. Will they ever attack Israel, nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't know. The Iranians are unpredictable, but the problem for the Iranians is that whatever they do, if they were to attack, Tehran would burn within 10 minutes because the Iranian missiles have to go all the way to Israel. But the Israeli missiles are already in Iran. They're not exactly in Iran, but they're very close to Iran. And, so the Israeli missiles are in the Persian Gulf. They arrive in Tehran in 4 minutes. So Tehran is a big city, so probably there'll be quite a lot of survivors. These are not very big weapons, but still, it would end Iranian civilization for sure. And as for Israel, the problem for the Iranians is that the Israelis have developed a kind of national industry of making anti-missile missiles. It's an Israeli activity, like embroidery. It used to be embroidery in the Hungarian countryside, beautiful embroidered shirts, The Israelis is making anti-missile missiles. And the Iranians have to go there by missiles, long-range missiles. And the Israelis manufacture interceptors. So they could have a bad experience, of launching nuclear weapons. Tehran burns. In the meantime, in Israel, they have ice cream. This is a very realistic scenario for the time being.
Thank you.
EMP? Yes. So EMP, I'm hoping for EMP. I wish we could have an EMP attack right now so that all these people crossing the street looking at their iPhones and all the school children who are staying up the whole night watching TikTok. So personally, I would pay for willingly to have EMP because, electromagnetic pulse does not be generated only by nuclear weapons. It can be synthesized. But by the way, if we had a high altitude explosion, very high altitude, you could have electromagnetic pulse destroying things all over the world and without actually causing any damage on Earth. Because if you will probably know, since you work on nuclear matters, that electromagnetic pulse was detected in the very last atmospheric test ever done, which was done by the Soviets. And they launched this over the city of Karaganda in Kazakhstan at an altitude of 159 kilometers. They detonated. Of course, nothing happened on the ground, but the power cable from Karaganda to what was then called Akmola, and then was called Astana, then it was called Nur Sultan, then it's called Astana again. Whatever it is, that power cable burnt. That's how EMP was discovered. You see, before that, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was passed after every American physicist testified before Congress that we have found all the nuclear effects, and that's why we can sign the treaty, to stop atmospheric tests. But the Soviets did one, and that's how we know we have EMP. So I personally would love to have EMP right across the United States. No more TikTok. No more stupid people crossing the street watching the thing, and it would be a great advance for civilization. Sorry?
We're talking Russia and Ukraine. That's I'd like to know what you think about. Like Odessa, the capital way to Transnistria. You think Putin would do something like that?
No, because look, remember, Mr. Putin did not declare war. He has not mobilized the Russian armed forces, because every unit in Russian armed forces has conscripts, 18-year-old, actually 17 and a half, 18, 19-year-old conscripts in every single unit. That's why he did not declare war. That's why he did not mobilize the Russian army. That's why he's trying to fight a war with whoever happens to show up, contract workers. Like, you're trying to run a war is at least as complicated as a gourmet restaurant. And you can't do a gourmet restaurant by hiring people off the street, getting to beggars and say, come on, and, start cooking this cream of sauce, whatever it is. So I don't think so at all. I think Putin is a reasonable person. He is willing to have a war, but he's not willing to go all the way. He's not, he hasn't declared war. Who's ever heard of such an outrageous thing as to have a whole war without even declaring war? That's really not fair. But I hold on to this wonderful vision that you suggested because of your professional expertise of EMP. Because everybody thinks there's no solution for this problem of iPhones and TikTok. There is, it's EMP. So I want to start a foundation, fundraising for having a EMP attack on one's own country, because then within 10, 15 years, your country will become the leading country in the world. Very simple. Yeah.
Balázs.
Superbly quick responses. The problem, of course, is you would have to set up that foundation on the internet and have people pay on their phones for that. So that's sort of a little problematic thing. But back to the question, of course, I think fundamentally military...
I do not preach in the church and practice and go to the bar. This is my phone. This is my phone. I'm that serious about this.
If I may, very brief reaction.
Everybody in the security business who goes around with an iPhone, he is not serious. He's a clown, because there's zero security. There's not possible. So we're in a transition phase. The people have to realize that there are some technologies that should really be excluded, limited, and so on. Certainly nobody who works in secret information can have an iPhone. Not with the reconstitution of data, which is now a routine, because the machine learning simplest application is to reconstitute data. So all you need is fragments and so on. So anyway.
Yeah, very, very quick. I completely share Dr. Luttwak's view that we spend way too much time on the phone. I think as a person, absolutely agree with that. How to limit that is a little more problematic, but I do like the...
To solve this problem for you, because I'm willing to sell you a phone like this for only $5,000.
Which is your much used. Right, but that doesn't solve the cultural and the framing and all these different wars. Very, very quick reactions to that. I think we will see testing before, nuclear EMP testing before we see any warfare use, because it's not about the warfare, it's about controlling the narrative. And if we don't talk about Russia's great power nuclear status, and Putin can't force the narrative in there, then I see a potential logic over there. But we'll get into that. Primacy and then... EMP, I'll leave it to the expert. On the primacy portion, and then I'll just quickly end with this, I think the unipolar moment is gone. There's no going back to that. And as long as the U.S.
Sorry, what's gone?
The unipolar moment, when the U.S. was able to dominate the systems. Yeah.
No, actually, I don't agree with you. All you need is to, you see, I want to remind you that there used to be a president called Jimmy Carter who could not even deal with the Iranian taking hostages, okay? And everybody said unipolar is all over there. Then what happened is Ronald Reagan became president, and within 8 years, the entire world balance changed. In other words, when you, the transition from Jimmy Carter, who could not handle power at all, zero. So he could not even deal with the Iranian buffoons and clowns, okay? He just couldn't. Then what happens is an election, and then this ex-actor, Ronald Reagan, becomes president, and within 4 years, the balance of power changes completely. And within 8 years, there's no Soviet Union, right? Now, Ronald Reagan was, well, I'll tell you the story. I have to tell you the story. I cannot tell you the story. I was one of his advisors. There was a thing called the Interim Foreign Policy Advisory Board. There was Al Haig, various other people. 8 people. All of them went into the government. I did not, because at the time I was starting my ranch, and I love cows and so on. So I didn't do it. But in that board, we received, immediately after the election, the State Department arrived to meet us and President Reagan, the future president. Until January 20th, he's a private citizen, of course. So, but they came to brief us, and they said, look, the challenge now is to work towards the September ministerials in New York. That is a reference to the meeting of the General Assembly, when the foreign ministers all go there, and that's when the American Secretary of State, that you, Mr. President, will choose, will be able to meet Gromyko in order to arrange the summit meeting. Because, of course, we have coexistence, we must have a summit meeting. And Ronald Reagan said, oh, boys, you don't have to worry about that at all, because I have no intention of meeting this guy. What's his name? You know, it was Brezhnev, then there was Chernyenko, Andrew. I don't want to meet any of these people. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to legitimize them. I don't want to put them in the same table. I was elected. They were not elected. It just so Ronald Reagan changed it. Now I want to tell you something. If there is a president who comes out, maybe the governor of West Virginia or something like that, or East Virginia, or anybody else, somebody comes up, and not like Trump, who makes enemies every day, but somebody like Ronald Reagan comes up, suddenly all these books and dissertations, films, articles, speeches about multipolarity would just go well just like that, instantly. And the reason is, as the Chinese found out when the Americans stopped selling them chips, is that actually the technological advantage is immense. The fact that the Americans don't use it doesn't change the fact that it's immense technological advantage. Immense. Right? But if they're focused, right now they're focused on transgender bathrooms and so on. It's not a joke, but you know, at Newark Airport, United Airlines has a whole beautiful club, and they have no toilets because of this transgender stuff. So people are peeing in plants.
Maybe we'll come back later. Okay, there's another question here.
Dr. Luttwak, you talked about how in Washington, the Pentagon, there's this love of non-kinetic action.
There was. They've learned their error, okay? They're now maybe making another error, but that error they've learned.
I'm curious if this might be the error. There's a new triad they talk about called with space, cyber, and special forces. Is there any validity to this, or is this more wishful thinking?
The special forces is the Hollywood effect. And the special forces culture is deserving of a study in itself, which is how you have this little beautiful flower, and you plant it, you get a little water, and then you come back and it's taken over the whole house, okay? The special forces thing is the value, the tactical, operational, strategic value of special forces is overestimated by a factor of 100 or 200, okay? I mean, let me give you an example. The Special Forces Command sent two helicopter loads of SEALs to attack and kill the gardener in Abbottabad and then Osama bin Laden, okay? The way I would have done the operation, and I have done operations, is I would have flown with Pakistani Airlines to Islamabad because they're cheaper. I would then have taken a taxi, me and a friend taking the taxi, argue with the taxi driver about the fare to Abbottabad. By the way, it's the only good road in Pakistan. The only good road in Pakistan is between Islamabad and Abbottabad. Then you arrive at the gate, you knock on the door, the gardener comes, you shoot him with your handgun. Then you walk in, you shoot the other guy, you cut some hair, you then go back to the taxi driver, you argue again about the drive back to Islamabad airport, and that's how you do the operation. But no, they sent two noisy helicopters in a city full of retired military people, which contains the Pakistani Military Medical Academy and various other institutions. One of the helicopters crashed. Okay, and the guy who did all this goes around making speeches as the great hero, okay? Which one of the helicopters was destroyed, you know. They were lucky that nobody died on it. But in other words, the special forces are overrated hugely. During serious wars, nobody has special forces. The German Wehrmacht had 1 battalion. They had a total of maybe 500 battalions, 1,000 battalions, they had 1. The British themselves had only the Royal Marine Commandos because they come off boats and they can't be very sure. The Special Forces culture is part of the drift away from reality. You know, it's the same as all this post-kinetic stuff. Hugely overrated. As for cyber is highly effective against people who choose to make themselves vulnerable. Don't try cyber attacks against me. No, you won't be able to do anything. I'm serious. So in matter of seriousness, in peacetime, all kinds of fantasies develop. Special forces is one fantasy. Cyber war is another. Remember that the Ukraine scenario was that the Russians would paralyze the Ukrainian response to the taking of Kiev with cyber. You know? So the war brought us back to some simple realities. Okay? First, the artillery takes the ground. Troops occupy. Okay? Elementary thing. Who the hell was interested in field artillery? It looks the same as in Napoleon's time. The only thing is, it works.
Yes, definitely. Yes. I just have a very quick question about Vladimir Putin's psychology. Every time things get tight around him, he starts saber-rattling about use of nuclear weapons. How seriously should we take that?
Not seriously.
That's it?
Not seriously, because, you see, in order to pass orders, we need authority. And in 1962, both the Americans and the Russians were willing to use nuclear weapons. Not just tactical or symbolic, but I mean, the Strategic Air Command of the United States, with hundreds of airplanes, they were absolutely ready to fly to Moscow and drop it with a nuclear weapon. Because they had the reason for that, which is better dead than right. Okay, it was an ideological thing. And the Soviets were different somewhat because they didn't trust their armed forces, therefore they separated the nuclear weapons were handled by the KGB. And they were keeping them 50 kilometers from the missile. So they would, to be sure that they don't misuse them. But in those days, people were serious about it. Now we live in a post-nuclear era. Post-nuclear. There's still many nuclear weapons, but nobody has a political structure to order the use of nuclear weapons. For example, the French president has a nuclear weapon. If Macron orders the French Air Force to drop a bomb, I don't mean on Moscow or what, I mean, no, just to drop one of their nuclear weapons, against a village of bad Cossacks or something. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. Only the British will do it. No, the British really love Soccer is good, but not enough.
You were not impressed by soccer hooligans before whom whole European cities cower.
Yeah, sure.
But now I have another. We'll take, I think, one or two more questions. Yes, the gentleman, this just here.
Well, great presentation and good to see you again. You talked about China, you talked about Russia and Ukraine. What's China's role in with Russia? And is there a role for China to bring this to an end?
Well, yesterday, once again, the Chinese foreign minister swore that the Chinese are not giving any ammunition to Russia.
Yeah.
And that is believable because the Russians even bought it from North Korea. And North Korean ammunition is rusty. It was really an inferior quality. It didn't work very well, but the Chinese are not supplying Russia. They're not supplying Russia. And there are different reasons for that. One of the most important reasons is that they want Russia to become weaker. Because the only unequal treaty which remains in force, the only one, is the Treaty of Peking, which gives the maritime provinces to Russia. Vladivostok, Nahotka, that whole area was taken in 1860. And because of that, Northeast China is persistently poor because it's cut off from container transportation. So for them, the only real enemy of Russia is China. And the only country that the Chinese, want really to attack is Russia. So every time Xi Jinping kisses Putin, Putin kisses Xi Jinping, you have to realize that actually in the long term, they are the only real enemies.
Another question, gentleman here, and also over there.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Luttwak, you spoke disfavorably about Sun Tzu and Chinese strategy of deception. Do you see any value in placing resources into deception with inflatable tanks or other
massive deception?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, when you have the deal with deception is this, you have to pay twice. First, you have to mount assemble a powerful invasion force to land in Normandy. And then you can spend some more money to have a deception force that will pretend to land in paper time. In other words, the problem with deception is great, but you have to pay for deception, and then you still have to pay for the real thing. So actually you're paying twice. You're repaying. Sometimes that's a good idea, but most of it's not. Most of it. I mean, it's not. I'm a great believer in military organizations because I was trained in the British Army. And there were two things that happened in the British Army. The first one is that they would have a figure of a person dressed as a German soldier, and you have a rifle. We had the Lee Enfield, which is a nice long rifle, proper stuff, not made of plastic and things like that, and had a bayonet. And first you have to show that you were stabbing the German with real conviction. You have to really bang into it. Then the Queen gave you ammunition for the rifle. You first have to show the willingness to kill the enemy, then you got ammunition. That's how it was in the Oxfordshire Light Infantry. That was the first huge lesson. And the second huge lesson is that my first deployment in the British Army was to Borneo, North Korea. So we arrived in North Korea with our uniforms made for Germany, and we had given German rations with the corn meal and so on in tropical conditions, you ruin your health within a week. Yeah. And I was actually a lance corporal, which is the lowest rank existing in the British Army, half a corporal. I went to the battalion commander, who was a landlord. We had a big landed estate, it's a proper guy. I said, look, I'm sorry to disturb you and all that, but listen, we are in the jungle and we are being attacked by worms and insects and all kinds of stuff. Where is the jungle expert? Because the British Army at the time is spending a lot of money training people in Johor, Malaysia, for jungle warfare. So I said, Colonel, where is the jungle expert? So tell us how to dress, how to eat, what to do, and so on, how to cross the water, because every time we cross the water. The answer is, he smiled. I remember the smile. He smiled, he said, yes, we have a jungle school in Johor, and all the graduates are now serving in BOLR, the British Army on the Rhine. British Army on the Rhine. Yeah, and so you fellows, you just have to figure it out. And that's what the British Army always did. In other words, they, unlike the Russian Army attacking Ukraine or whatever, the British Army goes into action knowing that it's going to be a complete screw. So you're ready for it. And these officers used to be people who had real knowledge, not of war, of course, but they were landlords. So they knew how to start tractors and this and that. And in fact, we won the war. Without having the wrong equipment, the wrong uniform, no expertise about, and we used to ban. We banned it in the jungle, People would go around, and that's how we did it. It worked. So, the British.
If I may say, we won that war, we won the Malayan emergency war too. It was a really
Sukarno, but Sukarno wanted the Holocaust. The British insisted that what was Sarawak. Sorry, Sukarno wanted the Holocaust, because he said, we have halves here and that. The British insisted in creating the Malaysian Federation and giving them 3 states. One is now called Sabah, one is called Sarawak, and one is called Brunei. And the British insisted on that. Why? Because, they were living in some Victorian fantasy, and the whole British thing is to continue to live in a Victorian fantasy without ever waking up. But Sukarno had his own fantasy because he sent these volunteers who were Jakarta communists. They were urban communists from Jakarta. The moment they arrived in the jungle, they were complete desperado. They were only trying to surrender to us, because if they did surrender to us, the Dayaks cut off their heads. And they're young because the Dayaks, the necessity, in order to get married, they had to have a head hanging at the corner of the hut, otherwise nobody would marry. So they needed heads, and Sukarno supplied the head, and we supported the Dayaks by going up the river with boats. So I will tell you, the only thing happened is that this bloody thing stopped. That's the thing, with these wars. As soon as you start enjoying them, they end. Then back to the rain.
Thank you. There is a question, I think.
This will have to be the last one.
Yes. Dr. Luttwak, I was just curious about how you see Nord Stream factoring into this, if you think that it's really dead in the long term, and also how it's figuring into America's strategic calculations, and if you have any view on what happened to it.
Well, the Germans are very good at everything, of course, except strategy. That's why they lost 2 world wars. And it was German strategy to believe that the right place to get natural gas is to get it from the Russian Federation. Hence the whole pipeline story. Instead of buying gas, there's huge surplus of gas around the world. There's so much gas around the world that even one of the smallest gas fields in the world, which is the smallest of the 3 Israeli gas fields, is supplying like 50 years of gas for a small market. It's a tiny, it was a tiny field developed by a private person. So there's lots of gas, but the Germans cleverly thought the best way to do it is to tie yourself, hands and legs by pipeline to Russia. Well, it worked for a number of years. And since the Germans also cleverly stopped all the nuclear power stations, they had to need the gas. So it's a wonderful thing. And then but I say the German chancellor should be brought to a Nuremberg trial because it was his take that if there's a war, there's something in Ukraine, because everybody said there's something, Zelensky runs away, so the whole thing ends in 3 days and so on. If there's some in Ukraine, they will not stop Nord Stream 2, okay? That was the green line for Putin. Green line. Putin is a reasonable person. And if I were Putin, and the American intelligence says I can have Ukraine in 5 days, the Germans say that they will not allow this to interfere with Geschäften. There's Geschäften, there's Krieg and Geschäften. Geschäften is more important. If Putin is told he can have Ukraine in 5 days with no problems at all, and nobody will complain, and so on, except the Poles, and nobody ever listens to the Poles. And he doesn't do it, he will be completely unpatriotic and absurd. For him not to do it. So if he's ever brought to trial, he can defend himself. He can defend himself. He said, I'm sorry, if you were in that situation, you would have done the same. Of course you would have done the same. Take a big country with no effort, and the Germans saying they won't allow this to interfere with this. So I think that's a good idea. We have a Nuremberg trial, we put in the German chancellor, and he's responsible for the whole war, actually. Putin just went to law.
Okay. Well, look, this has been a marvelous occasion. I'm going to invite Balázs to offer one final thought, and then you, and then...
Yeah, I'll split it into counter-value targeting. Dr. Luttwak talked about having either village or city is, I think, off the table. As I mentioned, I think nuclear testing is the next possible step. Counter-force targeting, once you start hitting troops with tactical nuclear weapons of mass which Russia still has, as the last nuclear option, I don't think it's unimaginable. But I don't think it's currently on the table. And I'll return to my previous comments because I think this is important and it's somewhat in line with what Dr. Luttwak says, although I wish I could believe that a single person can change the tide of history as much as Dr. Luttwak would like. Certainly, I think the US enjoys its primacy. The unipolar moment is gone. That's a different concept. And the US has a much better chance of clinging on to its primacy if it stops proselytizing. And proselytization comes more with the Democratic Party, and the potential governor of East Virginia does seem to do less of that.
And any final word that you would like to offer the audience? Thank you for an absolutely sparkling performance.
No, I think that's